Welcome to part 6 of our unit 6 on development. Today what we're going to be talking about is adolescence. So what is adolescence is basically the first part here. I'm trying to see if I can move myself out of the way a little bit. There you go. So what is adolescence? That's our first real question. So adolescence is it was the transitional period from childhood to adulthood. Now, usually it's going to extend from the beginning of puberty to independence. One thing that's kind of interesting about adolescence is for a long time, at least societally, it didn't really exist. That basically you were a child and then at some point you became an adult. And that was it, right? That there's not really any in between. Adolescence as an idea is something that's relatively actually new, at least when you think of like human history. Started kind of in during like the Industrial Revolution, where we started to see that there's differences and notice that there's large kind of jumps and gaps kind of in between childhood, or at least true childhood the way we think of it today, and true adulthood. And this is really what we call adolescence, where we're kind of transitioning in. Again, you can think about how even as an adolescent right now, you probably can kind of see that where you're not treated, if you have younger siblings especially, you're not treated like an elementary school kid. You can probably like stay home on your own, or you're trusted to get to places or go to places or have a job. But you're also not really an adult yet, right? You're not living on your own. You're not paying your own bills. You're not having to deal with all the things that you would deal with as an adult. So this kind of way that we define it is shifting and changing over time. Now, again, we're going to define it, at least psychologically, from this beginning of puberty to what we would call independence. Now, where independence really begins is kind of a little tough to nail down, because obviously that's kind of an arbitrary or objective point. But one thing that we have seen is that actually over time, the length of adolescence has extended quite a bit. So if you look at kind of this image here at the top, you can see in 1890, and again, this is looking at for women specifically, the beginning of adolescence was considered menarche, which is the first period. So it starts at menarche and it goes on until they're defining the end of it at marriage. So from at that point, it was, I think this is like what, a little bit over 14, 11, 12, 13, 14, yeah. Right before, in between 14 and 15 years old is where it would start, and it would end at about 22. Now, in 1995, and again, this is still quite a while ago, menarche had actually moved earlier. So today, and even today, that's still continuing to happen, where women are having their periods earlier than they used to. So it had moved up until, in between 12 and 13 years old, and marriage had actually moved back. So it was no longer at about 22, it's closer to, I believe, about 25-ish is where this is. So it had extended from what was considered this kind of 7-year period to this 12-year period. Now, again, we could also probably look at this today and would probably see this continuing to get wider, where it's, menarche maybe continuing to happen even earlier. If we wanted to continue defining it by marriage would definitely be pushed back even further. But we might also change, where this definition is of independence. Maybe marriage isn't necessarily the defining factor of independence anymore. Maybe it's living on your own. Maybe it's having a certain job or being able to doing certain tasks on your own. But we've seen this basically, what's considered adolescence, get wider and wider and get longer and longer. Really what's happening is we're seeing the start of the physical beginnings of sexual maturity and ending with the social achievement of independent adult status, right? This is really how we're defining it. So it's beginning with these physical changes. And again, those are the biological things that are basically telling us that you are able to have a child, or you're basically starting the beginning of where you would be able to have a child. And then social achievements at the end of you are now independent and an adult and considered an adult to others as well. So physical development. Now the big thing here is puberty. This is the most important part of the physical development that we're talking about. So puberty is the period of sexual maturation during which a person becomes capable of reproducing. It's pretty simple, really. There's obviously a ton of different changes that are going on, but the key part is that we are going from a child who is incapable of having children to an adult or an adolescent, right? Or someone who is capable of reproducing. Puberty follows a surge of hormones, which may intensify moods and some changes in behavior. So one of the big things that's happening is basically we're having a whole bunch of different hormones released in our body that are causing all sorts of different changes. We're going to talk about them more as we go, but we'll see a bunch of physical changes, we'll see emotional changes, we'll see mental changes, changes in the brain. There's all sorts of kind of pieces and things happening because of this large surge of hormones that's basically being released. Puberty, again, usually begins at around age 11 in girls and about age 13 in boys. So girls do start puberty a little bit earlier in boys. This is also why, like, if you're ever in an elementary school with like 5th and 6th graders, one of the things that's kind of interesting is if you're around those kind of kids, one thing you'll notice is a lot of times the girls are way bigger than the boys. They're a lot taller, they look much more mature, the boys still look really, really young. And the reason for that, again, is because girls actually start puberty earlier. So they basically are starting this maturation process before the boys. Now, eventually what generally tends to happen is when boys start puberty, they'll basically kind of catch up and most of them will surpass the girls, at least in like physical growth and things like that, which is why and you could actually even say the same thing if you look at freshmen in high school. A lot of the freshman girls are quite a bit bigger than the freshman boys, but by the time they're all seniors, that's kind of swapped for the most part. So what are we actually seeing here? At least with physical development. So there's basically two kind of sets of things that are happening. We have what are called primary sex characteristics and secondary sex characteristics, and both of them are going to be developing during puberty. I'm going to move myself out of the way so you can see that a little bit better. So our primary sex characteristics have to do with reproductive organs specifically. So the big one is kind of the first thing that's happening that tells us that we are now entering the phase of our life where we are able to bear children. So for women, it's the first menstrual period, which is called menarche. For boys, it's the first experience of ejaculation, which is called spermarche. So again, both of these signify basically the ability to then have children. And that's kind of a main piece, our primary sex characteristics. Now, in addition, we also have what are called secondary sex characteristics. Now, these are all physical things, but they're not necessarily connected to reproductive traits. So we see things like body hair growth, breast development in females, changes in voice and facial hair in males. There's obviously a whole bunch of kind of pieces here. And there's a lot of other things that we could talk about. Now, again, all of these are things that are not necessarily part of actual reproduction, but they are physical traits that kind of go along with it, right? That are connected to our journey from being a child, basically, to being an adult. All right, so now we're going to start looking a little bit more at the brain of teenagers. And I can't move myself still. Our teenage brain a little bit. Oh, and I move this up. Okay, here we go. I'm still in the way. All right, let's see. Where can I go? I'm just going to cover this up. Sorry, guys. So, in addition to all of these kind of the physical changes you think of, right? Like when I ask you, when I said, what happens during puberty, most of you probably think about, you get bigger and taller and you start to look like an adult and maybe you have body and facial hair, right? All those kind of things. In addition to all that, we're actually also having changes in our brains. So as teens are maturing, one of the things that's actually maturing last is our frontal lobes. So as we develop, our frontal lobes will continue developing until about the age of 25, until we're truly into adulthood. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about this is actually connected to a lot of the ways that teenagers act. So, for example, the emotional limbic system, which we talked about again at the very beginning of the year, is wired before the frontal lobes. Now, the frontal lobes are very much part of our judgment center of our brain. It's the part of our brain that tells us, hey, maybe this isn't a very good idea. So one of the things that's happening here is that in adolescence, as teens go through puberty, what's happening is our limbic system is getting fully wired, right? It's becoming more and more capable, which is again is the emotional part of our brain. But our frontal lobe is actually kind of basically not there yet. It's catching up. So what happens is we see as a result of this brain chemistry and this brain development, we actually see that adolescents can understand risks and consequences, but will give more weight to the potential thrills and rewards. So we actually see that in a chart right here. So we've got this sensation seeking, basically doing something that is fun or exciting or feels good or whatever right here. Right, you can kind of see this arc. And then we have impulse control. Now, again, if you look at, and you can even think of children, like children aren't necessarily known for their impulse control either. But right as we're going through puberty, which again is starting around, 11, 12 years old, going on into, our early 20s usually, all of this would be considered kind of that adolescent phase. Our sensation seeking is very, very high, right? It's actually peaking about 16, 17 years old. But our impulse control is way, way, way behind. So again, this kind of explains where you can go to adolescents, right? And you can teach them about all the horrible things that can happen in the world, right? You can talk about, if you're drunk driving and you get in an accident, you can talk about if you are having unprotected sex, you can get pregnant or get an STD, right? Or if you jump off that roof, you might get hurt. And all of those things are things that the kid can know. You can be a really intelligent adolescent or intelligent teen and know that things can go wrong. But even with those thoughts, even with that knowledge, a lot of times it's not going to necessarily inhibit them from taking those risks. They're going to weigh the idea of doing something that seems interesting or fun or whatever, or rewarding, over what could be those possible risks. Now, eventually what's going to happen, and again, you're seeing that in kind of the early 20s, eventually what happens is that impulse control starts to catch up. And at some point it surpasses, and that's eventually where when you look at how somebody is as an adolescent, and then you look at them as an adult, a lot of times it'll look really different, where there's no way that adult, even at the age of like 24, would do some of the things that that teenager was doing. And really a big part of that is that brain development has kind of caught up. That frontal lobe is now able to take a little bit more control and start making more decisions, as opposed to leaving it to the sensation-seeking, emotionally driven limbic system in the rest of the brain. So how does that really happen? In addition to kind of what's going on here, we're actually seeing some more development. I don't want to cover up this image just yet. I'm going to leave myself here and then I'll kind of move myself in a little bit. So we're also seeing some other pieces development in the brain outside of just certain like lobes and parts. So for one is we see growth of myelin sheath, which is going to enable better communication with other brain regions. So we're going to see obviously the myelin sheath protects our neurons as well as speeds up how fast they can fire, or how fast the information travels, I should say. So that's going to start speeding up our ability to think. It's going to allow us to think more deeply and at a more complex way than we would when we were earlier. In addition, we're going to see what is called synaptic pruning, which is actually what this image is about. So synaptic pruning is the selective removal of unnecessary neurons and connections to improve brain efficiency. So we actually see that. So right here, we've got a child at birth. Now, again, there's a lot of cells in here. These are actual neurons and connections that we're seeing. There's a lot of cells in here, but you can see there's not really a lot going on. There's not a lot of connections happening. Now, in between birth and about 7 years old, we're seeing, again, a whole bunch of connections. We're basically creating all sorts of different connections. We're learning languages. We're learning how to interact with people. We're learning emotions. We're learning tons and tons of different things in those first 7 years of our life. Now, what's interesting is when you look at a 15-year-old, though, there's actually less of those connections and less of those neurons than there were at 7 years old. And again, what's happening here is basically our brain is going through and it's pruning it out. You can think of the way someone might prune a bush or a rose bush, right? For example, you go in and if there's a dead thing, you kind of snip it off. And that actually helps the brain overall. So what's happening is basically it's getting rid of those unnecessary things. If there's parts that we're not using, there's information we don't need, there's skills that we don't need, that we don't care about anymore, they basically will kind of be weeded away, and it allows the rest of our brain to function more efficiently. It allows it to work a little bit better. And again, obviously, we could see that with kind of the increase in our cognitive abilities as well in between those time periods and as we continue on through puberty. It says, during puberty, our brain stops automatically adding new connection and becomes more efficient by rewiring. So again, instead of just kind of immediately making new connections all the time and just trying to kind of grow as much as we can, now it's going to be a little more efficient, where to create a real connection, there's going to have to be things going on again and again and again. And it slows down learning a little bit, I would say. You look at like young children and they learn how to speak incredibly quickly, where if you look at the same, even at 15 years old, if you try to teach someone a language, it's incredibly challenging, right? It takes a lot of time. Now they can still do it, but it's much harder than if they're a baby. So it might slow things down a little bit, but it's going to be much more efficient, right? Obviously, the abilities of a 15-year-old are far above, a 7-year-old or an infant. These developments bring improved judgment, impulse control, and the ability to plan for long term. Again, these are all kind of things that we saw a little bit on the last slide, where we are basically kind of having these abilities that, again, are very much connected with becoming older and becoming more of an adult, right? Generally speaking, adults are going to have better judgment, are going to have better impulse control, are going to be able to plan long term better than adolescents do, in general. So let's continue to talk about this a little bit. So we're also going to see a few different things when we look at adolescent cognition. So one of them is what is called adolescent egocentrism. Now, we already talked a little bit about egocentrism when we talked about our Piaget stages. So we're kind of seeing a similar idea, right? This inability to see from somebody else's perspective. Now, adolescent egocentrism is a little bit different. It's not as much about being unable to see other people's perspectives, but it's this belief that their experiences are unique, and that other people couldn't understand those experiences, especially like their parents or other people who are older or don't necessarily fit into that peer group, right? I think what's really interesting about this is when you sit back and you kind of think about it, the reality is every adult has gone through puberty. Every adult has gone through adolescence. They've had to deal with all of these kind of different social things that are happening. Now, they might not be exactly the same, but a lot of it is very similar. So adolescent egocentrism is this idea that even though we've got these people who have gone through these different things, we believe that our experiences are unique, right? There's no way that you can understand what I'm going through, when I break up with my relationship, even though, you're 30 years old and you've had multiple relationships when you were younger as well, right? That's that idea of adolescent egocentrism. We also see what is called the personal fable. So personal fable is a type of thought common to adolescence in which young people believe themselves to be unique and protected from harm. So again, this kind of goes along with that risk-taking behavior, where we can go out and I can maybe give you statistics on, like I said, drunk driving incidents or speeding accidents or STIs or teen pregnancies or all these kind of different things, right? But even with that information, teenagers are still going to, or adolescents are still going to, a lot of times carry out these behaviors. And one of the things that we see is what's called this personal fable, that even when we say, hey, if you have unprotected sex, for example, you could get pregnant and have a child. And they go, yeah, but that wouldn't happen to me, right? You can't believe the fact that there's no way that I would ever be the person that happens to. And the reality is obviously it happens to some people, so it's possible in there. So this idea of believing that you are in some way not going to get injured, right? That even if there's, even though I know there's car accidents, I would never be the person that gets in the accident, even if I'm taking maybe these more risky behaviors. And again, we see this may cause teens to engage in risky behaviors and create an overly optimistic sense of the future, right? That you believe that you're going to be able to do things, that you're unique, that nothing negative could happen, or at least not these kind of bigger negative things can happen. And it could cause you to be more risky. And then obviously if I'm doing that, that can lead to negative consequences as well. Next we see what is called the imaginary audience. So the imaginary audience is pretty simple, and I'm sure all of us have felt it at some point. Imaginary audience is a type of thought common to adolescence in which young people believe that other people are just as concerned about the adolescent's thought and characteristics as they themselves are. Now again, this is like a very wordy definition. It sounds really weird, but it's pretty simple. It's basically this idea that you believe that everyone else is as focused on how you look, what you said, how you dressed, what you're thinking about as you are. So like a really simple idea or a really simple example is maybe you woke up one morning and I don't know, maybe you have like a zit or you're having a bad hair day or whatever, and you notice it, right? So you go to school, and as you're going through the day, all you can think about is every time you talk to someone and they're looking at you, all you can think about is the fact that they must be staring at the zit, right? They must see it. They have to know it's there, right? You walk into a classroom and you're like, oh my God, everyone can see it, and people can't stop staring at it, whatever. Oh my, and you're thinking about it over and over and over again. That's imaginary audience, right? Where the reality is a huge chunk of the time, other people are just as concerned with maybe what they're doing, or they're worried about something else, and they may not even notice. So this idea that other people are as focused on you as you are on yourself. That's really kind of what the imaginary audience is, that people are paying attention all the time. Where did my mouse go? So from here, we're going to start looking at something a little bit different, which is moral development. Now, we really start to see a lot of the moral development happening in adolescence. It doesn't necessarily like all happen in adolescence. It doesn't necessarily even start in adolescence, but we start to really see it kind of taking growth here at a bigger level. So again, this is going to be connected with some of our different social development and cognitive development as well, but it's a little bit different. So when we're talking about moral development, what we're talking about is our ability to tell right from wrong, to control our impulses, and to act ethically. Again, when we were talking about just these basic ideas, right? This is what right is, this is what's wrong, this is what I should do, this is what I shouldn't do. You know, me actually doing this, me stopping myself from doing this bad thing. All of those things are what we would call morality. This idea of good and bad. Then again, so we have to develop that over time. We're not born with morality. It's something that over time we build, we develop, and we grow in. This is a very simple chart of Kohlberg's levels or stages of moral development. I'm going to go through each part individually, but I think this is just kind of a nice chart for you to see and maybe kind of put your stuff into a little bit. I'm going to just define each of them a little bit differently than this chart does, but it gives you like a nice layout. So basically there's 3 levels: level 1, level 2, level 3. Level 1 is pre-conventional morality, level 2 is conventional morality, and level 3 is post-conventional morality. So we've got these 3 levels of morality. Then within each level, we've got stages. Okay, so it's generally going to go, in order. So stage 1 of level 1 is going to be the very beginning. So we've got stage 1, we've got stage 2, then in level 2, 3, and 4, and level 3, 5, and 6. Sorry, so you basically would kind of work through these individually. Like I said, I'm going to go over each of them, so we'll keep moving here. Let me move myself again. So our first level, and again, we're really kind of we're going to look at both stages kind of together because they're pretty similar. Our first level is what is called the pre-conventional morality. Okay, it's pretty simple: pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. So you should know the order of the levels. Pretty easy. So pre-conventional morality is generally going to be children, people before the age of 9. And what we're really seeing is we tend to do the right thing to avoid a punishment. Again, if you've ever been around a young kid, they don't necessarily do the right thing because it's right. They do the right thing because they know if they don't do it, they'll get in trouble, right? That's stage 1, right? I'm not going to, push somebody over because last time I did that, my mom yelled at me. That's stage 1 of level 1. Stage 2 is basically the exact same thing, except for now I might not necessarily be doing it or not doing it because I'll get punished, but because I will get something good, right? I know if I share, right, I'll get a reward. Or if I pick up my clothes or I pick up my room, I'll get a reward. I'll get a candy bar or whatever at the end. That would be stage 2. So stage 1 is avoiding punishment. Stage 2 is to gain rewards. One thing that's interesting is when we see these, young children see rules as fixed and absolute. Obeying the rule is important because it's a rule. Not necessarily because it has merit or because it's a good rule, but because it's something that they're supposed to obey, they obey. And again, if you've ever been around young kids, one thing you might notice is if those rules are different for different people, they don't understand that, right? If you have a young sibling or you babysit a young sibling, they might expect that you have to follow the same rules they do, right? And if they don't, or if a sibling doesn't have to follow those rules, right, they don't understand why, right? They're like, no, this is a rule, you have to do it. And that's really this kind of, again, this very beginning stage of our moral development. From there, we will move into level 2. Level 2, which is called conventional morality. So conventional morality is starting generally around early adolescence. And what it is basically this idea that people follow rules to gain social approval. You do good things because people notice that you do good things, and people like that, right? So someone drops their pencil in the hallway, and you're going to rush and help them pick it up or whatever, right? Because people will think of you as a good person. That's the idea of conventional morality. Stage 4, which is still in this conventional morality level, is that it might not just necessarily be to have social approval, but to maintain what we call law and order. Right, we do what's right because it's our duty to do the right thing, and we have to maintain this idea of law and order, of following things, and things have to go a certain way. Now, most teenagers and adults think at a conventional level. So one of the things that's interesting about these levels of morality is that you don't necessarily have to go through each one. This isn't like Piaget stages where every single person, or every single person, at least without like some sort of disability or something, goes through them. These moral stages are a little more iffy, right? That you can or maybe you don't move. Now, again, most of us will probably move past pre-conventional, but not everyone will move out of conventional, right? A lot of people will spend their life in this conventional stage of morality where you're doing things because other people, you'll gain social approval, or because you have to maintain law and order, right? There's a duty of keeping things the way it's supposed to be. Our highest level is the post-conventional level of morality, post-conventional level. So level 3. What we're going to see here is kind of a step beyond some of these ideas. So for stage 5, what it is promoting a society's welfare. So we do these things, or this is the right thing to do because it's good for society. Okay, not necessarily because it maintains law and order, not necessarily because I'm going to get any sort of reward out of it, but because it's good for people. It's good for our society that we live in. And number 6, which is pretty closely connected again, is to promote basic rights and self-defined ethical principles. So this idea that you do something because it's what you believe is the right thing to do, right? I'm promoting the rights of other people. I'm protecting the rights of other people. I'm doing this because I know it's the right thing to do, even if, again, it doesn't necessarily fit with law and order, right? It doesn't necessarily fit with the rewards I would get socially. It's just I'm doing it because it's right. Now, again, what can be challenging is there can be conflicts between what is socially acceptable and what an individual believes, right? So we can look at a whole bunch of different things that have developed over time, right? We could look at, and again, today, these things might all seem like very simple and straightforward, but at the time they weren't, right? So we could look at women fighting for the right to vote. We could look at the civil rights movement. We can look at the LGBTQ movement. All of these are at the core, right? There's people who are looking, who are in the sixth stage, where they don't gain anything socially out of being part of those groups, right? Like being part of the civil rights movement during the time was not something that people liked. And today we look back on it and we go like, oh, everyone loved Martin Luther King. The reality is like, I think it was 67% of the population of the United States had a negative view of him when he was assassinated, right? So the people, obviously some people had individual things to gain out of that, but some of them didn't, right? So those would be people who would say, we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, because I believe it's right. And even though maybe there's going to be negative consequences, maybe there's going to be things that society doesn't think is acceptable, right? Because I believe it is, I'm going to continue to do that, right? Now again, and I think too, like there's a reason like I put Superman on here, because that's really his whole thing, right? His thing is he's going to do the right thing no matter what. He could do whatever he wants, but what he's going to do is protect people and do, what he believes is right all the time, right? And that's kind of really epitomizes this idea of being in this post-conventional stage of morality. So again, those are Kohlberg's different levels. Each level has 2 stages as we kind of move up. Now again, not everyone gets to this post-conventional morality. A lot of people are very likely to stay in conventional morality. Now, there are some criticisms with Kohlberg's theories here. So the first one is that Kohlberg's concerned with moral thinking, but there's a really big difference between knowing what we ought to do versus our actual actions. So that's a really, really big criticism, is he really just cared about what people thought. What did they believe was right, and why did they believe it was right? But the reality is in real life, you can think something is right, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to act on it. So actions is a really important piece, or a really important criticism of these different levels that Kohlberg talked about. In addition, his theory is very heavily criticized for being Western-centric with a bias toward men. So for example, he used primarily male subjects from the Western world in his research. So obviously, if I grew up in a different place or a different culture, a different background, I might have very different views on what I think is right or wrong. And the worldview based on the upper middle class value systems and perspectives. So his criticisms are really kind of about, one, not being able to really truly apply, missing this idea of actions, but then also the fact that it doesn't seem like he took into account a wide variety of genders, of different cultural backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, different economic backgrounds as he was doing this research. So there is quite a bit of criticism here of Kohlberg's moral levels. So last thing we're going to talk about with adolescence is our social development. So we've talked about the physical development, the cognitive development that comes with that, the moral development, and now we're getting to the social development. Now, we will look at Erik Erikson's model of psychosocial development. That's actually the last section of this, where Erikson goes through all of the different developmental stages in his theory of development. But we're going to talk just a little bit about what he says about adolescence. And again, we'll see it later on at the end as well. So we haven't quite gotten to him, but we will. But basically, he has this theory of psychosocial development. And in each section of this theory, basically what happens is we have a struggle, and then we have kind of a thing that develops out of that, right? We kind of pick a path that we go this way or that way. We either, kind of excel or overcome this struggle and gain this kind of positive characteristic, or we don't and we gain this kind of negative characteristic that stays with us as we continue to age. So in adolescence, he sees the struggle as our forming of an identity, right? Forming of a sense of self, of knowing who you are as an individual. We can really see that pretty well, right? Many teens try out different roles to determine the best fit, dressing differently, changing groups of friends, and engaging in a range of different activities. And this is actually something that's pretty common. If we're in school and you kind of can look at, when you're a freshman or even in middle school, right? And you look at who you were in a middle school as a middle schooler, right? What were the activities you like to do? Who were the people you hung out with? What were you interested in? How did you dress? How did you talk? And you look at, as you go through and till the end of high school, what you'll notice is you'll probably have tried on a lot of different things, right? You probably tried a bunch of different activities. You maybe joined different groups. You had different friends that you interacted with. You probably changed how you dressed, your style. You probably had different types of relationships, whether they were friendships or romantic relationships. All of these things are kind of this idea that during this time period, you're trying to figure out who you are. And I think that's a really big thing that a lot of adolescents are asking themselves, right? Like, who am I? Who am I going to continue to be as I go on into the rest of my life? So this is the big struggle that Erikson believes that adolescents are working on and struggling with. So what part of this is, what does it mean to be or have a social identity? What is that referring to? So social identity is the we aspect of our self-concept. It's part of the answer of the question, who am I? That comes from our group memberships. So if I asked you, to write down who you are and just put down as much as you can as what would be the things that define you. Your social identity is the part that has other people in it, right? So whether that's your family, whether that's your friends, whether it's a sport team or a band or a group that you are part of, right? For like a really simple example, for me, part of my social identity is being a teacher and a coach, right? Those are things that are part of who I am because of the social aspect, right? It's a group thing that makes it part of my identity. So for both adolescents and adults, group identities also form around how we differ from those around us. So again, a lot of these pieces are the things that are making us unique, right? These differences. So it's the groups we're in, but it's also the differences we have from other people. So if you again were writing down, tell me about yourself, you would probably be very likely to write down not just things that people think of when they think of you, but you'd probably write down things that make you different from your friends and the things that make you different from your family members. And those would be the things that you kind of actually hold on to, maybe even a little bit tighter in your identity. So it's how we kind of define ourselves based on the people around us. So let's look at some other pieces of social development. So for example, and again, we're kind of still continuing this idea of social identity. So some adolescents forge their identity early and simply adapt their parents' values and expectations. So again, a lot of these things can be very dependent on what's going on in this child's life and how they fit in or don't fit in. So if you were born and you fit what your parents believe you should be really, really well, right? So maybe your parents, if you're a boy, maybe your father was really into football or something like that, and he was a football player and he's a football coach now. And as you grow up, you end up being this really great football player as well. That would probably be an example of an adolescent who'd be very likely to form their identity really early. And all you're really doing is you're kind of tweaking little pieces, right? Like, you're going to generally be pretty similar to your parents, but you're going to tweak little parts, right? You might not be exactly the same, but overall, your values, your expectations, what you think should happen, how you act, are going to match theirs very closely. Now, on the other hand, we do also have adolescents that are likely to adopt identities that are actually in opposition of their parents. So what we'll see here a lot of times is maybe as an adolescent or as a kid, we don't really fit those different values and expectations. So because of that, right, we might adopt a group that maybe feels more closely connected to us. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this is this doesn't mean when people rebel, they really don't rebel on their own, right? Teenagers don't rebel against their parents and be by themselves. They rebel into a different group. So it's not that they don't want to. They might not want to conform to a broader society, or they might not want to conform to their parents' ideas, but they're going to conform to a different group. They're going to conform to something else. So they might form an identity with a peer group, right? So maybe they feel much more closely connected with like the jocks, or they feel much more closely connected with the goths, or maybe they're really closely or getting along better or connecting more with like a science club or something like that, right? Those would be identities that they would then take on in opposition to the ones that their parents have. So we can kind of see these different trajectories that we can go. There's not necessarily anything right or wrong with either or, but it's just kind of differences that we seem to see with social development. Again, one thing too that I want to mention that's really important, and again, we'll talk about it with social development, or when we talk about social psychology in general, is it's really, really, really important for us in general, but especially as teens, to fit in somewhere. You don't have to fit in with everybody, but we have a need as human beings to create relationships and to fit in. So a big part of adolescence is really focused on that, of finding a group and connecting with that group. Now, sometimes that group is going to be a group that is very close to my family. Sometimes that group might be my family. Sometimes it might be a group that's the complete opposite, and I'm close with them despite the fact that my family doesn't like it. But either way, we want to find a group, and we will conform to that group, at least in some ways. That gets us to romance. So romantic relationships are really going to first start emerging in adolescence, right? Like you may have heard, sometimes like little kids in elementary school will be like, oh, I have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, but that's not a real romantic relationship, right? Like they're not actually having a relationship. Adolescence is where we first begin to see kind of real romantic relationships, where they're first kind of emerging. Now, generally speaking, romance in adolescence is going to be short-lived rather than long-term. So a simple example of this is when you're an adult, if people have been dating for a year, that's kind of like, oh, okay, they've been together for a little while. If you're an adolescent and you've been dating someone for a year, that's like a really big deal. It's a long time, right? So these tend to be much quicker relationships than we'll see later on in adulthood. Romantic relationships are really important, though. They contribute to adolescents' identity formation, changes in family and peer relationships, and adolescents' emotional and behavioral adjustment. So how these relationships go have a lot of different impacts. So they can impact the way that we see ourselves, so the way that we identify ourselves and the way we see ourselves, again, in relation to others. It can affect the way that we see our family and the way that we see our friends. It can affect the way that we feel emotionally and how we adjust and how we learn to deal with or maybe not deal with our emotions and how we behave. All those are things that are actually happening through these relationships, right? A lot of adolescent relationships are really about learning, about figuring out how to have romantic relationships as we continue to get older. Now, one thing we do see actually is that the earlier dating begins, the more harmful it can be. So one thing that's really interesting, I think, is that at least as an adolescent, I feel like a lot of people feel like it's a bad thing to not date, or they know people who've been dating, had a bunch of different boyfriends or girlfriends or whatever. But one thing we actually see is that people that start dating really young, we actually can see harmful and negative consequences coming out of that. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean that, if you started dating really young, that your life is going to be a disaster or anything. But we can basically see that it's can be more likely to cause some harmful things, right? That we learn maybe negative things about our identity, maybe that we learn things, negative things about how relationships work or how they should work. And we can kind of see that, when children are starting relationships really, really young, it actually can be more harmful, as opposed to if they started having relationships a little bit later in adolescence, where we won't see, as much of these kind of negative consequences. Or at least, and again, there's not necessarily always going to be negative consequences, but it just becomes more likely and can be more harmful. Let's see, I'm still in the way here. Okay. Now, again, as we talked, and I kind of mentioned this already, as adolescents seek to form their own identities, they begin to pull away from their parents. So this is a really important piece of social development, right? This is a really important piece. So it's not just that all these things are going on. This is a time period where you're going to start moving away from your parents. You're going to start separating from them. At that same time, right, we're going to see an increased connection and a moving towards our social group, our peer group. So as kind of the influence and the power kind of the parents go away or slowly kind of go down, we're going to see greater influence and greater importance placed on our peers. This is why peer pressure is such an important thing, where like you don't ever talk about peer pressure with elementary school kids, because most elementary school kids are going to listen to their parents at the end of the day, right? If a parent is like, no, you can't do that, they're probably not going to do it. As we get into adolescence, all of a sudden, those scales kind of start to shift a little bit, where now all of a sudden, well, you might do something even if your parent really doesn't want you to do it, if your peer group really wants you to do it. So again, adolescents become heavily emotionally invested in friends. Adolescents can be easily influenced by the people they develop close relationships. And again, this is just the very basic idea of peer pressure, which you've all heard about a million times. What their friends are, they often become, and what everybody's doing, they often do. And a really simple, actually, example of this I can give you is when I first started teaching. My first teaching job was actually as a PE teacher for middle school. And me and the high school teacher used to do this experiment where we would basically kind of keep track of who people hung out with, right, in our different classes. And we would compare that, and we would look at like different grades and things later on. And one thing we noticed is basically you can kind of cluster kids up. If you let them pick who they hang out with, generally speaking, groups will hang out with groups of people that are similar. So if I look at a kid's grade and that student has all A's, I can look at that friend group and assume that they all also have very high grades, whether they're A's or B's or just generally are doing very well, right? Where I can look at other students where if they're doing really poorly, they have all F's or they've got a bunch of F's and D's, I can look at that friend group and I'm very likely to see the same things in that friend group, right? So we are very much influenced by our friends and the people that are around us. Now, this is especially influential, again, in adolescence. This will happen forever, but especially in adolescence, the people we hang out with, we become them. We start to dress like them, we talk like them, we act like them, we do the things they do. So again, this is something where as a parent, it can be very stressful because you're watching that happen. You're watching that child. You're no longer basically able to kind of guide this child as much as you maybe would like to. And you're seeing them be now guided by their peers, which, can be positive or negative, obviously, depending on the groups that child is in. But this is something that we see very, very common. It's not necessarily bad, right? Obviously, eventually we are supposed to form our own identities and no longer be driven by our parents. But this is something that's going to be very much happening during this time period. So that'll wrap up our conversation of adolescence. Again, take some time, do a brief summary just about the things in general. I know there's a lot going on there, and I will see you guys next time.